Senator Mark McDonald calling the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules to order. First item on the agenda is to convene, review, and approve the minutes of September 8th. Before we do that, we will introduce ourselves.
Senator Chris Bray from Bristol, Vermont, representing the Addison Senate District.
Ginny Lyons, Senator from Williston, representing the Chittenden County District.
And Representative Mark Higley from Lowell, representing the Orleans-Lamoille District.
Representative Seth Bongartz from Manchester, representing Arlington, Manchester, Sandgate, and a sliver of Sunderland.
I actually learned where Sandgate was. Good morning, everybody. I'm State Senator Joe Benning from the Caledonia District, which is all of Caledonia County and the 6 northeasternmost towns in Orange County, at least for now.
Good morning, Trevor Squirrel, representing Underhill and Jericho, and sit on the Appropriations Committee.
Mark McDonald, representing most of Orange County.
Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I help the committee.
So that's, and Mike Ferrant, who is keeping us on Zoom and making sure we have our materials. Thank you, Mike. First item on the agenda is to approve the minutes of September 8th. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Senator Ray has moved that the minutes be approved. Is there any discussion?
Just a question, Anthea, do we normally make a note of somebody making an adjournment motion?
I can start.
Not to be technical, but I just wanted to make sure.
Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. And the minutes have been approved. First item on the agenda. 22, E13, the Office of Professional Regulation, Emergency Administrative Rules for Notaries Public and Remote Notarization. For the Office of Professional Regulation, Secretary's of State's Office, Lauren Lehman is our witness. Lauren is on Zoom. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's the small print. I'm sorry. Didn't see it. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours. Share with us what we need to know about the proposed rule.
Thank you all, and thank you, Senator McDonald. This might seem a little bit like Groundhog's Day to all of you. I'm back again with our remote notary rules, and that was heard often in the legislature this past session as well. I'm here today to ask for the renewal of the emergency rules for remote notarization. This and also a slight amendment to them and an underlying waiver to newly adopted legislation. And I'll explain all that as quickly as and as succinctly as possible. And then, obviously I'm open to questions and further discussion because it is a unique situation we find ourselves in. So what I'm asking to waive is there was a newly adopted law in May of this year that facilitates online remote notarization and electronic notarization. And because of the more significant complexities with those two forms of notarization, the law requires, it's Act 171, it requires a special endorsement on the commission issued by OPR for those notaries public who are seeking to perform electronic or notarial acts via electronic means or through technology such as identity proofing and other forms. What's authorized in Act 171 is much more technically complicated than what's authorized in the emergency rules. And the emergency rules, if you recall, were adopted in March 2020 to facilitate notarial acts to continue, transactions to continue when people could not meet in the same physical space. And so these emergency rules facilitated that, but they still require a wet signature on the document. They still require somebody to show their ID card to the notary public. So they don't rely on technology to do the electronic signature or to proof the identity. This Act 171 that was approved in May will allow those, but they will be subject to the notary public having the special endorsement on their license or on their commission, excuse me, and to a subject to rules regarding technology standards. So all of that was adopted in May of this year. We at OPR, unfortunately, have not had the time to put in place permanent rules implementing Act 171. We just, we have 50 professions, we're doing telehealth rules, we just don't have the resources to have done it in the last 3 months. We do anticipate having those rules in place in March, but unfortunately, the emergency rules don't require that special endorsement. And Act 151, which went into effect, or 171, which went into effect on July 1st, requires that endorsement to do any notarial acts for remotely located individuals. So our emergency rules, in essence, conflict with Act 171. What OPR is asking today is the emergency rules be renewed until March 9th, and when we have more permanent rules in place. And with one small revision, with one revision, which is in, I believe Anthea provided you with an edited version today. And we're asking Lcar to approve this revision, which would waive the special endorsement requirement until the expiration of the rules. So it wouldn't allow the full, more complicated identity proofing and electronic notarial acts that are allowed in Act 171. It would still be tied to that more limited emergency rule authority of being able to do notarial acts by showing your ID, by putting a wet signature on the document, but it wouldn't require the special endorsement. So that's what we're asking for today, is to waive that conflicting standard for this limited purpose until March 9th, when we have the resources and opportunity to put in place a more comprehensive and permanent structure around the fuller scope of notarial acts. So other than that, the rules remain exactly the same, with the small technical change that in Act 171, the legislature repealed the term secure communication link and replaced it with communication technology. So you'll see that revision as well. We just made the terminology consistent, and we updated citations to reflect the citations in Act 171. So it's technical changes and this more substantive change of the waiver that we're proposing.
Any questions for the witness? So we usually ask at this point, when we are extending emergency rules for the purposes of COVID, we ask, does this emergency rule contain any changes that the previous emergency rule didn't contain? And I believe the witness talked about a special endorsement was a new requirement as part of Act 171, is that correct?
Yes, and that's what we're seeking to waive in the revision to this emergency rule, other than this, just until we can more permanently implement Act 171 fully.
So, with the exception of the special endorsement, it's essentially the same emergency rule that we've had since the declaration of COVID.
Yes, correct. With those terminology corrections, technology.
And you are asking us to waive the thing that had been added to the long existing emergency rule until next March.
I'm asking to waive the provision that was enacted in the most recent legislative change, statutory change, by putting a provision in the emergency rules, waiving that new statutory provision until March. So delaying its effective date until March 9th, 2023.
I will take that as a yes.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm not inaccurately representing anything.
So I, thank you. So committee, now, I guess it's up to us to determine whether that's a policy change or it's approvable under the emergency rule. I don't know the answer to that question. Senator Lyons.
Did we get any memos from committees of jurisdiction, chairs of committees of jurisdiction on this? But that would answer the question for me.
Representative Copenhagen's Facebook just a second ago.
We have not contacted any committees of jurisdiction on this.
Senator Lyons, I did include them on the correspondence that I sent you yesterday. So they are on the loop on, or their email inbox is in the loop on the fact that these waiver has been sent. So what you have that I printed out of the correspondence from yesterday, you'll see that that top chain did go to both of the chairs of the standing committees.
But did they reply?
Yep. This one, this is good. Senator Lyons, they did get a response from Senator White. It won't let me edit, but it does meet legislative intent. That was sent on September 15th. So that was before the revisions, but the underlying rule, Senator White said it met legislative intent.
Okay, thank you.
May I add something to that?
Certainly.
So the intent and the purpose of the rule is exactly the same as what was initially before proposed and what Senator White responded to. This just clarifies a conflict. So if the emergency rules were adopted as is, there would just be a conflict between Act 171 and the emergency rules. But so that's what we're trying to clarify. But the purpose and intent of continuing to allow notaries public to perform notarial acts for people who are located remotely remains exactly the same and would have the same effect until March 9th, practically.
Senator Bray.
Ms. Lehman, so let me make sure I'm just understanding. It sounds as though you're saying that it's not any kind of opposition to what 171 requires. It's just a question of, on a practical level, it's delayed implementation so you can do it in a way that you think is proper. Or
Absolutely, Senator Bray. Thank you. Yes, it is fully intended to, OPR supported Act 171. We have the ability and the means to implement it. We just have not had the time since May to do it. To put it in context, the notary statutes have changed every year since OPR got authority to adopt rules. It's in 2018. So we've been waiting for the kind of let the statutory dust to settle before adopting rules on a more permanent basis. And so there was a new statute 2018, revised statute 2019, then COVID, and then the uniform rule that our statutes was based on changed in 2021. And then in 2022, we got revised legislation again. So it's been a moving target until May of this year. And we think that the dust is settled. We have a very good foundation now, and we're able to implement everything. We just haven't had time since May.
I'm only one member of this committee, but I would suggest that the answer to Senator Bray's question was yes. Is there any further discussion? Senator Bray.
So with a slight comment, I've really appreciated that OPR has worked very hard during the pandemic to be nimble as it can be, to provide different ways for people to continue to carry on all sorts of kinds of business, including notarized signatures. And so I just wanted to note for the record how hard you all and successfully you all have done in the last couple of years on that challenge. And then I'd say I'd like to move approval of Rule 22E13, Emergency Administrative Rules for Notaries Public and Remote Notarization with the modifications proposed by Ms. Lehman in her correspondence dated on October 5.
It has been moved that the rule be approved with the additional language that Senator Ray just offered. Is there any discussion? I would like to second, and as all committee members would, Senator Bray's comments on the hard work that your folks have done. And while we may sometimes seek truncated answers to complicated questions, you have been thorough in answering our questions, and we thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, the motion is made. Shall the rule be approved as the motion suggests? If so, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. And the rule has been approved. And thank you very much for your testimony and for the thorough job that you have done in the last couple of years since we've been dealing with COVID issues.
Thank you all.
Next on the agenda, 22E14, Department of Health, Board of Medical Practice Emergency Rules. For Board of Medical Practice on Zoom, David Herlihy. Mr. Herlihy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Senator McDonald. Thank you. So I'll try to be brief. The board has in its existing rule a provision regarding how people must complete the United States medical licensing exam sequence. As the USMLE, as it's known, is used by every state and territory now. States used to, a long time ago, have their own individual tests, and we changed to a nationwide test. The USMLE has been in place since 1992. The board for decades has had a rule limiting how many years an applicant may have taken to complete the testing sequence, beginning with when they take the first test they take until they complete the third step, which is the final step. And our rule provides that it must be completed within 7 years of the first attempt, or if the applicant was enrolled in a dual MD PhD program, they can have up to 10 years because of the additional time. The test is taken beginning in medical school, and the extension of time to do the combined MD PhD program adds years to that process. So the reason why we had to come up with this rule is that during COVID, there were disruptions to the testing administration. The USMLE contracts right now, and I think the only contractor they've ever had that I'm aware of is called Prometrics, and it's an organization that has testing centers that provide, proctoring and security for the examination administration all over the country. And so when COVID came on, there was actually a couple months period when there was no testing at all. And then when the company overall lifted the Prometrics had said there'll be no testing. And then as things opened up and it varied from state to state, because as you know, not all states were the same in their response. Some sites began to open and others weren't. And for the most part, they all, as you'll recall, we were living with limitations on how many people could enter different places at a time. And so they were at approximately half or less of their capacity. The bottom line was, for many months, and at least into late 2021, there was a backlog and people experienced difficulty being able to take the test. And then for some others, the step 3 is given only in the United States. There is some availability overseas. And many of the applicants who take the test are from other nations and have to travel to the US to take the third step and complete. So if there were still travel bans in place, individuals may not have been able to travel to come and take the exam. As a result, some people, through no fault of their own, who were coming up on the 7 or 10-year limit may run into problems meeting this licensing standard. And we last month we encountered one. I didn't think it was going to happen so quickly, but it did. We had somebody who was coming, and it was rather difficult circumstances. Springfield has an extended gap for a surgeon, and we had someone who was coming to fill that role who had run into just this problem. She was completing her surgery residency, and she was unable to take the USMLE when she wanted to take it. Now that individual, she was only about, I think it was 4 or 5 months over the 7-year limit. And most people you see, they complete the whole series within about a 4 or 5 year time span. Surgery tends to be one of the longest residency programs. And for personal reasons, she had delayed. No fault of her own. She passed each step the first time she took it. But she was not going to, under our existing rules, she was not going to be able to get a license to come here and take the job filling this opening for a general surgeon in Springfield. So, we looked at this and the board said, this is through no fault of these individuals. And so we need to get a rule on the books to provide some relief for people in the situation of not being able to meet this requirement simply because of COVID. The board decided they wanted to err on the side of being, inclusive, allowing people to take the test who may have been affected by this. Well, the time limitations are considered important, and most states have time limitations for qualitative reasons and for the integrity of the exam. The board felt like they should be liberal in granting, saying anybody who is coming up on this limit to give them 2 years additional time to the limitation in order to qualify for a Vermont license. This is a little bit different. This isn't just like a COVID rule. This is something that looking down the road, we may have to tweak this a little bit from what we did in this emergency rule, because this was done very quickly in a matter of days. We had to get the board to approve this and then start the process with the department and the Agency of Human Services to get this in effect in time for this applicant to be able to take advantage of it. But this will be around for a long time because we have people who are 70 years old or more apply to get for the first time to get a Vermont license. And so we could have 50 years from now, there could be people still who ran over the 7-year limitation, and assuming that it's still on the books, they would might run into that issue. So, this is the rule as we've written it down. We'll be looking at it going forward. What is the best way to do it? But this will be provide relief for everybody for the time being for the next couple of years. Well, it wouldn't be as an emergency rule that long, but certainly for the 6 months, this emergency rule will be in effect, will be effective to provide relief to all who need it. I'd be happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Senator Lyons.
David, thank you for this. I think the rule, it makes sense what you're talking about from my perspective. I do have a question going forward, and that is that obviously my committee has discussed the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and how to identify changes that we might make to statute and or to rules in different situations. And this seems like a place where you might wish to recommend committees of jurisdiction that in times of a declared pandemic or residual, I don't know how we'd word it, that this rule would take effect. So so some thought to the ongoing work would be helpful. I mean, not right now. It's not a rule thing, but it's certainly something that our committee would like to and would welcome. So that's all.
Question is, shall the rule be approved? Any further questions from members of the committee? Senator Lyons.
I don't have a question. I have a motion to that we approve Rule 22E14 regarding the Board of Medical Practice emergency rule.
Senator Lyons has moved that the rule be approved. Is there any discussion?
Makes total sense.
If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. And the rule has been approved. Thank you, Mr. Hurley, for your presentation and for keeping up with the changes from COVID and testing and for picking up on this problem and providing a solution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator McDonald, and all the members of the committee. I appreciate your time.
Which brings us to 22P05, Vermont Public Utility Commission Rule 8 on cable television. Witness Jake Marin, staff attorney for the Public Utility Commission. Mr. Marin.
Morning, Senator. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me clearly with the mask on? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm here to present proposed revisions to Commission Rule 8.00, which governs cable television service generally, and the revisions we have are specifically in Section 8.313, which governs line extensions into unserved areas. Maybe a new home builder or a person who is into a house that does not have cable service would like to get cable service brought to them. And Section 517E of Title 30 gives the Commission authority to require cable operators to extend service if there are a sufficient number of new customers in the area, or in the case where there are fewer customers, require a contribution to aid in construction from the potential new subscriber. These changes are an outgrowth of a consumer complaint that was filed in 2019. The Commission had an investigation in that case, and the case ended up settling where the potential customer and the cable operator agreed on an acceptable price for the line extension. But the case, raised questions about whether our rule was clear and whether it could be improved to facilitate line extensions. And so we had several workshops with cable operators and the Department of Public Service. And as a result of those workshops, we've come up with some mutually agreeable revisions. They accomplish three sort of significant things. The first is it clarifies how the length of a line extension is. This is important because the length of the line extension determines how many new customers you need in order for the cable, the situation with the cable operator would be required to pay for that line, or otherwise determine what each customer's contribution will be. The longer the length, the more customers you would need for the cable operator to have to pay for it, and the greater the contribution could be from the customers. And so what this rule change does is clarifies we're measuring from the end of the existing plant, wherever that cable line ends. There had been questions because the second change we have clarifies what costs you can include in the project. And the disputes that were discussed in this process were related to network upgrades on the existing cable plant. Sometimes the cable line is not just that coaxial copper line, there's also fiber that backs it up sometimes. And that fiber may need to be extended for a significant distance along the existing plant where there already is coax line. And so the question was, how do you measure that distance? Do you count that fiber that's being extended on the existing plant, and you include the cost of that fiber in the project. And so what the commission's clarified is you keep the cost. The cost of that new fiber is included, or any other network upgrades, but the length is measured from the end of the existing plant. And the commission believes that creates an adequate balance, or a reasonable balance between the costs that should be borne by the customers, the new customers who are extending service, and the cable operator who is, extending their plant. The third set of changes in the rule relate to sort of the process of how the estimates are presented, the cost estimates are presented to the customer. The commission is adopting a standardized form that's actually being developed by the Department of Public Service that presents those costs estimates in a standardized format. So there isn't a difference between how estimates from Comcast or Charter are presented to new customers. They're all going to look the same, and it should be easier for customers to understand why they're being asked to contribute for certain construction work. And then also there are timeframes that are laid out in the rule for when those estimates should be developed. And those timeframes have been expanded slightly to allow the cable operators to develop more comprehensive and accurate estimates. Overall, the commission believes that these changes will result in a more standardized and smooth line extension process, and will also ensure that customer contributions in aid and construction are fair and reasonable. Take any questions.
Representative Higley.
If I could, you had talked about the provision where the cable operators can charge for fiber that may be needed to go along with the cable or extend the cable. Did I see in there too, though, that there are other infrastructure costs that would not be able to be considered in that?
So the test is whether or not the new infrastructure is but for the line extension. Obviously, cable operators are going to constantly need to be doing network investments. And if it's the kind of investments that they're doing in the normal course of business, then we would not charge the new customer for that. The situation is only if the cable operator would not have made this investment but for the new customer, then the new customer will be asked to contribute to it. And they may not have to pay for the entire cost of the upgrade. If there are other customers joining on that new segment, they would share in the costs.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Questions for the witness? Senator Bray.
Thank you. So in terms of, I know the department, and I just want to understand who represented consumers in your workshopping?
The Department of Public Service.
Okay.
Yes.
And are you, obviously you're presenting a rule, so you're satisfied with the balance between consumers' desire to get service and a operator's desire to make money when they're delivering service. Do you have a sense of, a lot of times when there's an investment, there's a period of time over which you're covering that cost? Does that period of time match how fast all this technology is changing?
Certainly, so the rule has a formula in it for allocating the costs, and the formula is designed so that at a certain number of customers, and I believe the number is 17, if there are 17 new customers per mile, then the commission assumes that the new revenue from those customers will adequately compensate the cable operator for building that new line. So those new customers wouldn't have to contribute anything. So once you get past 17 customers per mile, their contribution goes to zero. But as you have fewer and fewer customers, it becomes uneconomic for the cable operator to build that new line. And that's why the rule requires those new customers to make a contribution. The technology, though, I mean, a lot of this is just copper wire that they're hanging. So I'm not sure that the technology changes the cost as much as, obviously in today's supply chain constrained world, costs can vary considerably for these construction projects. But, I'm not aware of there being sort of a technological shift that causes the construction cost of a mile of cable line to really be that significantly different than it was in the past.
I think I'm asking in part because when we were working on this topic in finance, for instance, one of the concerns on the statewide implementation of more broadband service addressed the fact that we had a shortage of people to provide the work. The cost of all the supplies was going up during COVID, and we were concerned about how expensive it might get for all parties, and would that slow down the rollout?
Well, I'm going to have to give a little bit of a caged legal answer here, which is that this rule is specific to cable television providers, and the Vermont Public Utility Commission does not regulate internet service providers. While we recognize that there may be some overlap between the companies that are providing these services, the commission is really looking at what's the fair allocation of construction costs versus new revenue to the company, and the interest of spreading broadband is not necessarily a motivating factor for the commission in this rule, because there are limits to our jurisdiction and our ability to require the cable companies to do in the name of expanding broadband coverage.
I have one more. Thank you. The other thing I'm not aware of, so on electric utilities, infrastructure investments are allowed I don't know what you want to call it, a guaranteed rate of return. But is there a similar design in terms of when a company invests money, they have a reasonable expectation of making a profit on that investment, and it's built into like a tariff?
Excellent question. So there are some fundamental differences between electric companies and cable operators. The big one is that we do not rate regulate cable operators. They are in a competitive environment. They're competing with satellite providers and over-the-top internet providers for television services. But I think a thread of what you mentioned there does make its way into the formula, because like I said, the formula assumes that at 17 customers per mile, it is economic for the cable operator to expand, and we would require them to expand into those areas if customers ask without contribution. So that concept does live on in the rule, but we do not rate regulate generally the cable companies through tariffs or things like that.
Thank you.
Senator Lyons.
I think Representative Odie's first.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there places where you're not allowed to put cable TV, like unfragmented forests or wildlife corridors?
Oh, are there construction, well, I think I'll have a difficult time answering that, just because it's a little bit outside of what the commission does. We do not issue permits for the extension of cable services, just because that's not within the commission's jurisdiction. It may be, first of all, the cable lines that we're talking about here are often hung on existing telephone poles. It's not like we're cutting new swaths of the forest to build transmission lines, which the commission would be, regulating and doing the environmental oversight of. But to the extent you did need to put up new telephone poles, and clear areas, that construction activity would likely be subject to oversight either through local jurisdiction, because they have oversight of distribution lines, which the commission does not regulate, or A&R also has its own permitting processes that apply to construction generally, such as wetlands requirements, and other things, and sediment erosion control and things like that. So I don't want to say this is an entirely unregulated space, but it's not one that the commission oversees directly.
Thank you.
The technical, I've always had in my head that it was 12 customers per mile, not 17. If I just been stuck in the past somewhere, or
I believe around 2010, that the number was increased.
it's now 17 customers per mile is considered
Yes, and
the benchmark?
yes, if I'm looking at the annotated version of the rule, but on page 9, you'll see the formula there, and it's a mathematical formula. It's mostly letters, and one of the letters is H, and the H factor is the assumed number of customers per mile. And actually that number can vary per company, but there is a assumed maximum, which is 17. But if the commission found that a company had, could make it work with fewer, then they could have a lower H factor than 17.
One of the goals that you shared with us was that formula would result in fair and reasonable costs, as determined by whom?
By the commission. By the commission.
Against what criteria has the legislature set forth for the commission to make such determinations?
So the statutory authority for this rule explicitly directs the commission to determine the reasonable cost, the reasonable contribution for cost of construction from customers. And so it's a reasonableness standard, and that is a sort of common utility regulatory standard. Reasonableness, whether it is fair, is really the
as determined by the commission.
As determined by the commission. And so you're looking at what is the actual cost of the materials being, installed. What is the reasonable contribution from the new customer given those costs.
Senator Lyons.
So the chair has asked one of the questions I was going to ask about regulation of determining costs and cost-benefit analysis. The other question I have is with regard to the billing piece where the cable may be out for 24 hours and then customers are credited with that. And so that means that we also, in this state, can regulate the billing.
Yes.
So to what extent can we regulate the financial side of cable television? Because it never ends. It never ends going up.
The commission certainly has jurisdiction over service quality and terms. I think also we do receive notice of their terms and conditions. I'm looking through this rule just generally, and I will confess.
So the contracts between customers, whether it's a commercial customer or other, are fully disclosed to the commission. And is there some equity across the board for different organizations and areas of the state? I know I'm starting to get into policy and I don't want to do that, but I'm curious.
Yeah, and I'll confess that, cable, rates and charge. I'm looking at the section there is a section of the rule called section 8310.
Right.
Rates and charges, and I'm just looking through it generally. We certainly have requirements on the books here, I see, but I will say from a 30,000 foot level, what the commission is looking for is make sure that those services are provided, equitably across all customers, which doesn't mean the same. Discrimination between different classes of customers may be appropriate if the different classes of customers have different characteristics. But, I will only say that I also know that we do not set that prices in the manner that we do for or gas companies.
Is that because of the federal
regulation? There is a federal Cable Act overlay that preempts us from certain aspects of cable regulation. Yes.
Oh.
Senator Benning.
I'm thinking about the scenario of a cable that exists on a main street and a new road is built perpendicular to that main street. Let's say it's a mile long, at the very end of which a new house is built. If I understand this correctly, that individual, a mile out, will be expected to contribute to the cost of the cable being brought. What happens if there's a second home built between that home and the original cable?
Excellent.
Are they also subject to that
yes.
contribution? So if 16 homes are built along that road, in spite of the fact that the cable has already gone out to the end of that road, 16 homes in between would now also be subject to that contribution?
Depending on when they are constructed, there is a period of time set out in the rule where there is reallocation of the costs and potential reimbursement of that first house. So we'll call that house at the end, house A.
Yep.
If they are the only house, they're going to pay 100% of that 1 mile extension. House B comes in 6 months later. They are going to contribute 50% and it'll be reimbursed to 50% will be reimbursed to house A. And then it would so on. But that only lasts for so many years. I believe after 7 years, new customers are not required to contribute at all at that point. So there is a time period, a time limitation on that.
Questions? You commented on the ability to regulate fiber or something like that in your testimony?
Did the department?
Yeah.
No, they did not.
So,
I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood you. When you say regulate fiber, did you mean include the cost or exclude the cost of fiber?
the fiber came up in your testimony.
Whether the cost of those network upgrades were properly included in the CT factor, the cost factor in the formula, yes, that was at the heart of the discussion, whether those costs should be included or not, yes.
So one of the state's goals is to extend fiber as far as possible. Mm-hmm. These rules are seem to be changes to existing rules to modify them to be more modern. Is that a fair characteristic?
I think that to provide clarity to the regulated entities and to the customers so they can understand why they're being asked to contribute to certain.
So when you extend TV coverage through cable, does that not affect the cost of broadband deployment that did not exist before you extend cable?
Cost from whose perspective? From the company's perspective or from the customer's perspective?
Well, if you extend cable to the areas that have 17 homes and they now have cable, how does that affect the marketing and the take-up rate for fiber over that mileage that's just been extended for cable?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I would expect that some customers would like, to receive internet service along with their cable television, but I don't know whether it's all or some. It's just something that I don't know.
So I'm looking at these rules with how these rules change the policy of building out fiber. And it's generally been testified to in finance and natural resources that when you satisfy people's need for watching TV and movies, that they're less inclined to sign up for fiber when it goes down and duplicates those same poles and wires, which makes it more expensive to get fiber out to everyone. How does the PUC in proposing these rules balance or deal with that problem as a policy issue, or does it simply ignored when these rules are proposed?
I want to be careful to say that this is focused on television, cable television service, and not on providing internet. I do think, though, that it is a reasonable assumption that by creating clearer, more transparent rules that will facilitate cable line extensions, it will potentially lead to more broadband internet being provided, because those customers may be able to obtain broadband service from those same cable companies. But I will also confess that is an ancillary benefit of this rule and not one that was primarily motivating the changes that we have here. But what I'm detecting from your question is that there may be competition between cable companies and other fiber providers who may also want to run their wires down that road. I can't speak to that issue just because that is really outside of what the commission works on.
So in what you're describing, I think, when you run cable down 2 miles down a road, it makes it more expensive at the end of that 2 miles to run out fiber, which is the state's goal, because the take-up rate in those 2 miles, people are not going to be as likely to take it up because they already have TV. And that's something you're not speaking to?
I will confess, yeah, that's not something that we looked at in this rule, making whether people would prefer internet provided from a cable operator versus some other fiber provider. It's also possible that the cable operator is providing fiber services. It just depends on which cable company you're talking about. But again, that it really is outside the scope of this rulemaking, which is focused on cable television.
Well, just as one member of the committee, if the PUC is not considering it, heavens, who would be considering it? That's the PUC's bailiwick.
And I hope I'm not, the commission is, as far as I'm aware, does not have jurisdiction over any internet service providers.
You do not have jurisdiction, but the PUC knows what's going on out there. Would the PUC ignore their knowledge of what's taking place out amongst the far ends and simply operate with blinders to pursue a policy that might be retarding the development of broadband out into the hinterlands? Now, the chair, I may be crossing the line and my colleagues can tell me that I'm going too far. Senator Lyons.
Yes, Senator, I was thinking as you were speaking that this is an area for deliberation by the committees of jurisdiction. So if we have sounds like we have a little more regulation over cable TV than we do over internet. And so that the discussion around competition for services and how they are advertised, deployed, and billed, I think is something that Finance Committee and with the House, what's the House Committee? I'm sorry.
Technology.
Yes, could review. So, and I think it's an important issue, but I'm not sure that this set of rules is going to solve it. I don't think this set of rules. Yeah, I don't know if this set of rules can be changed to solve it. So I would strongly recommend that we send a little note off to our friends in House and Senate.
I agree.
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
we may be, and PUC through its rulemaking, trying to solve a legitimate problem of how to allot the costs of build out. Very well be building something out that retards, delays, and makes more expensive getting world-class broadband out into the countryside. And if that's what's happening, then perhaps the committees of jurisdiction are allowing it to happen, so that's why
Inadvertently. It seems like it's an inadvertent consequence.
it may be inadvertent, but the cable companies know what's going on and they're not, okay. So
Yeah. So
I'm abusing my
no, you're
chairmanship.
not. The question would be for me, if we don't approve these rules, what are the consequences? What's the deadline for the rules improvement? And is there some way to communicate with the chairs of committees of jurisdiction to get their feedback on this?
What is the consequence?
Well, I think the first consequence is that you're going to see customers continuing to have a difficult time requesting cable line extensions because they're not getting their estimates in a consistent fashion, and there is a lack of clarity about what costs should be included in those estimates and how the length of the line extension should be measured. I will stress that the Department of Public Service participated fully in this process. I know that the Department of Public Service is also very focused on expanding broadband. They did not raise any issues about this conflicting with state broadband policy, and they very much wanted the commission to adopt rules that address these issues. And so I appreciate the chair's concern about state broadband policy, and certainly the commission, I shouldn't say we don't act in a vacuum without consideration of those things, but in the context of this proceeding, no one raised this issue at all. And even if they had, it may have found that issue may have been identified as somewhat outside the scope of our rulemaking authority. So it really is, the commission would, looks forward to hearing from the committees of jurisdiction about, what we can be doing to not cross toes. But I would also say from where we sit right now, we have not been presented with any information suggesting, in fact, that this rule would somehow inhibit broadband expansion. In fact, the customers who are seeking line extensions are often doing so because they want broadband. And so.
Look, when you say broadband, what do you mean? Numbers. Give us the up and down.
I can't, because there are many cable operators who have offered different services across the state. Yeah, if you're talking about Comcast, I used to have Comcast cable internet, and I think it was 100 megabytes up. The down, the down was. But all right, I have it backwards. That 100 megabytes down, the upload was less. But again, this is really a TV rule, not an internet rule.
This is an internet rule, did you say?
It's not an internet rule.
Not an internet rule.
What level of internet can you get on TV, cable, copper?
That's what I apologize, because this really is outside. I'm an attorney for the commission, not a telecoms expert, but
Okay. Committee, thank you for indulging me, but you can't regulate broadband copper without affecting broadband fiber. And for the PUC has been put in a difficult position of having to, and apparently is going ahead and doing this. And that's the challenge before us, and I thank you for your indulgence. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chair, I guess my sort of take on this, listening to the discussion, is that the rule, while we have sort of uncovered a potential issue and a potential conflict that would make sense for the legislature to look at, my take is that this rule doesn't impact that one way or the other. It simply is looking to fairly allocate costs for the cable portion. I think we've raised an important issue and one for the legislature to look at, but I'm satisfied that the rule helping to allocate the costs fairly is better than having them allocated unfairly in the meantime. So that's my sort of take on where we are. So I would be prepared to adopt the rule when the time comes. With the caveat, and by the way, I'm in full agreement with sending the letters to them.
Is there any further discussion? Senator Bray.
I think I'm in agreement with what Senator Lyons said, what Representative Bongard just said, so I would move approval of Rule 22P05 from Public Utility Commission Rule 800, cable television.
Senator Bray has made a motion to approve the rule as set forth. Is there any further discussion?
With a letter?
I think we do that at the end, right?
Okay, yeah, we do it separately.
If there's no further discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Thank you.
I appreciate the very robust discussion.
Letter? We do it at the end.
I know. That's why.
Which brings us to.
He'll do it at the
We're on this one, right?
Yeah.
We're going through the other one is postponed, okay. 2209, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Water Quality Standards. We have a series of witnesses. And I would, I guess, take them in the order in which they're listed on on our agenda, unless there's advice to change that order. We'd start out with Peter Laflamme, Director, Watershed Management Division, Department of Environmental Conservation. Mr. Laflamme.
Good morning. I'm testifying remotely. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Excellent. It never seems to be a problem with me. Good morning, committee members. I'm here this morning with Hannah Smith, our Office of General Counsel representative here at the department, and with Bethany Sargent, who's the manager of our monitoring and assessment program, in whose program the rules actually reside. And my remarks are very brief. We are duty bound by EPA to do a triennial review of our water quality standards. As a result of a couple different factors, we're running late in that review this time. So these rule amendments would be to update our current set of water quality standards that are dated from January of 2017. And we are prepared. Hannah is going to walk you all through sort of the bullet point list, as it were, of our proposed changes to these standards. Hannah will also speak about, and the three of us can join in on the various meetings that we've held on this, the public comments that we've received, our responses to those comments, and our tweaks to the rule as a result of those comments. But if there are no questions to that brief background, I'll turn it to Hannah, who can lead us through the proposed changes.
Good morning, committee members. For the record, my name is Hannah Smith with the Agency of Natural Resources. This is an extensive and fairly technically complex rule. As Pete mentioned, these are revisions that we're required to adopt in order to stay in compliance with the federal standards for meeting water quality requirements. We do this on a 3-year basis. We are a little bit behind. In addition to meeting our federal obligation to update the standards, this rulemaking also satisfies the requirements of Act 32 of 2021, which required the agency to update the standards to incorporate an explanation of the standards applicability to wetlands, as well as an explanation of our 401 water quality certification process. So there's additional language in here that addresses the requirements of that statutory language. I'll go through a sort of high-level bullet point of the changes that are made. Again, it's a long rule, so please stop me if there are questions as we go. In the applicability section of the rule, proposed language would replace the existing language with the following, stating that the applicable water quality standards shall be those in effect at the time of final permit or certification issuance. This language is intended to comply with federal requirements that say a similar thing related to final disposition of a permit or certification. Consistent with that applicability update, we've updated applicability as it applies to certifications issued consistent with a FERC licensing process, clarifying specifically that water quality standards shall be those in effect at the time that that FERC issues notice of an application ready for environmental analysis for a license. This is the point in time at which the agency receives a 401 water quality certification application. So the applicable standards would be those in effect at that time. So we can begin our review. Moving on, the proposed changes to subchapter 1, references to wetlands and the wetland rules were made in sections 101, applicability. We added the statutory definition of a wetland to the definitions section, and we added language referring to wetlands in section 104, which is the classification of water uses and the anti-degradation policy. These updates, again, were consistent with the requirements of Act 32 of 2021. In section 102 definitions, the definitions of physical habitat structure and stream processes were revised to include reference to the portion of the riparian area that supports woody debris recruitment and temperature refuge, clarifying the importance of those areas in terms of habitat protection. The definition of mixing zone was revised in a minor way, just to clarify that the agency does not use mixing zones to meet the water quality standards for bioaccumulative toxins. A section was added to subchapter 2, which is the application of standards, referring to water quality certifications issued pursuant to section 401 of the Clean Water Act. This language clarifies that the application requirements for 401 water quality certifications, identifies applicable rules and requirements of state law that are referred to when reviewing those applications. And it includes the Vermont wetland rules for issuance of 401s associated with federally licensed or permitted activities. Again, an update that was done in response to the discussion around Act 32 in 2021. In subchapter 3 under section 302, the change clarifies that the 30-day low flow, this is referred to as the 30Q10, that these flows apply for chronic criteria that utilize a 30-day average. The definition of 30Q10 was also added in the definition section for clarity. In section 304, the hydrology criteria, and 305, the numeric biological indices and aquatic habitat assessments, and proposed language changes clarify the methods applied for assessing aquatic habitat and ensuring compliance with the hydrology criteria. So 2 notable changes were made to Appendix C in this round of updates. Appendix C refers to water quality criteria for the protection of human health and aquatic biota. One proposed change reflects the EPA 2018 water quality criteria for aluminum. And the second change clarifies that site-specific freshwater copper criteria may also be calculated using the biotic ligand model procedures that were identified in EPA's aquatic life ambient freshwater quality criteria. These updates are intended to bring our standards into compliance with the federal requirements for water quality criteria. In Appendix F, 3 streams in the Lower Otter Creek watershed have been proposed for reclassification as A1 for aesthetics, aquatic habitat, and aquatic biota. These are the Alder Brook, Blue Bank Brook, and Goshen Brook in the towns of Ripton, Lincoln, and Hancock, and Goshen. The streams were considered by the agency for reclassification in response to a petition filed by the Ripton Conservation Commission. In Appendix G, which is the application of biocriteria, some clarifications and corrections were made to address omissions. These were primarily technical corrections, nothing substantive here. Additionally, Legislative Council reviewed the draft and provided some technical corrections. Again, these were inconsistencies in abbreviations and capitalizations. And the agency intends to make these corrections in response to Leg Council's input before filing the final adopted rule. And that's the high level overview.
Thank you. We've got many witnesses, and I don't know whether the committee wants to ask a question from the 2 that we've already heard from, or to continue down the list.
I have a quick question.
Senator Lyons.
Do you think that you could add a link in when you are discussing the wetland rules and the annotated version on page 12 and 13? So just to have a link to those rules so that when folks are going through this, they have that quick look and understand where class 1, class 2 are and are not. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a good idea, Senator Lyons, and we will make that change.
Thank you.
Any other questions for this witness? So we,
Mr. Chair,
Senator Bray.
are you thinking that once we hear from other witnesses, we could come back to the agency?
Certainly.
Great.
But I'm looking for the committee's pleasure on how to move down through here.
Appreciate that as well. Come back if we.
So, Bethany Sargent?
Yes, this is Bethany Sargent, and I'm in the same room with Pete Laflamme, so I'm using his microphone to avoid.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
She's in the same room with Pete Laflamme.
Okay. So Mr. Laflamme and Sargent are operating as a team, and we'll head on to Mark Nelson, Chair of the Ripton Conservation Commission. Mr. Nelson.
Chairman McDonald and members of the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, thank you for allowing me to testify today in support of these new water quality standards. My name is Mark Nelson, and I'm the chair for the Ripton Conservation Commission, and I speak on behalf of the Conservation Commission members. I'm here to testify in support of the reclassification of the 3 headwater streams that were mentioned in Ripton. They will be reclassified from B2 to A1 for aquatic biota and wildlife, aquatic habitat and aesthetics. This reclassification is embedded in these new water quality standards. They're in Appendix F, and I think they're on page 74 is where the 3 streams are listed. To give you some background, the Ripton Conservation Commission, we'd like to thank the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Conservation for considering our petitions to reclassify Alder Brook, Bluebank Brook, and Goshen Brook from Class B2 to A1. These petitions were submitted per 10 VSA Section 1253, which is classification of waters designated, reclassification. The Ripton Conservation Commission, we worked a lot of hours and a lot of time to understand all the requirements for stream reclassification and all the requirements for submitting these petitions. From May 2017 through December 2019, the Ripton Conservation Commission worked with members of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation to research, write, and submit the petitions. The petitions were submitted in 2019, and from December 2019 through 2022, the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation reviewed our petitions to ensure that they were administrative complete and to start their internal procedures for evaluating petitions to adopt, amend, or repeal surface water and wetland rules. The results of this work today. I'd like to veer from my written comments for a second. I included that in there so you could understand the amount of time and work and effort that went into this. And I would hope at some point in time that the agency and the department would simplify this process so that citizens could do this work in a much easier manner in the future. Or on their own, they could identify streams and reclassify them without this amount of work required by citizens to get it done. Our investigation and research supported the water quality sampling that's been done for many years for these streams. These 3 headwater streams are some of the most pristine streams in Vermont, and they really are if you look at the data, and they meet the requirements for the A1 classification. The benefits for reclassifying these streams from B2 to A1 for those particular categories, they reflect the current conditions showing excellent to very good biological and chemical health and aquatic habitat. And this is also protected under Vermont's anti-degradation policy. The streams will be managed to achieve and maintain waters in their natural condition. Providing these streams with a higher level of protection will assist in managing our streams and wetlands in such a way as to help protect against the impacts of extreme weather events, which Vermont has been a beneficiary of in the past and probably will be impacted again. And protecting these headwater streams is part of Vermont's overall effort to address water pollution. These are headwater streams that provide clean water and filtration for the downstream waters. We hope the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules will approve the reclassification of the Alder Brook, Bluebank Brook, and Goshen Brook streams. We appreciate the time and work that's been required to review our petitions and to consider all of the public input that went into this process. Again, we thank the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Conservation for considering our petitions. And we look forward to protecting these streams for the animals and plants that depend on them and for the future generations of people that will enjoy them and benefit from their biological and ecological values. And I'm open to any questions.
Questions for the witness?
Mr. Chair, if I could, thank you. You had talked about these new designations creating a higher level of protection. What are some of those? What do you see as the commission was looking for and what they are?
Yes, good question. And we did a lot of research on this, pardon me, because we wanted to understand what would be the impact to our neighbors in Ripton and the surrounding communities. The one thing, Ripton, we don't have a lot of agriculture up there. We really have none, and same with the other areas. But logging, silviculture was one of the questions. If a landowner meets the acceptable management practices as set forward by Forest Parks and Recreation, then they're deemed that they're complying with all requirements to protect these streams. The other requirements really had to do with if you had land, how could you or could you not development and the size of sewage treatment system that you could put on it. The size of sewage treatment system that's allowed would be, if I remember correctly, up to a 4 or 5 bedroom house. So there really were not a whole lot of restrictions around this. A lot of it is recognizing these streams and as I said, protecting them for the future. And so that those lands couldn't be developed over time, which would impact those streams. And many of the properties that were within the watershed are already in use value. So they have, I'm going to use the term restrictions loosely here, but they have requirements, thank you, around what they can or cannot do on those parcels. Does that answer your question, sir?
Pretty much, I guess, just a follow-up question if I could. When you talk about the land could not be developed, and is there a specific buffer area that we're talking about and a specific length? And, you know, are property owners aware of this new designation and what it means to them? Is there?
When you get to specific details, I might defer to the Department of Environmental Conservation folks for the buffers but were the landowners made aware? We went to great extent to make landowners in Ripon and the other communities aware of these petitions. And we had several public meetings. In fact, the time frame for people to submit public comments was extended because of restrictions around COVID. So we went out of our way to make people aware of what we were doing and allow them to have opportunity to submit comments. And for the restrictions, as I said, I'll defer to the folks from Department of Environmental Conservation for more details, if that's okay.
Sure. And again, I guess, you know, I'm interested. I've got some other questions from others as well. But during that public hearing process, was there folks that came and had some concerns with that new designation? And how was that addressed? How was that explained to them, or were they satisfied in the end? What was that process like?
They could submit their comments at the meetings. They could submit their comments in writing. And please, my friends at Department of Environmental Conservation, if I say anything wrong here, please butt in, okay? All of their comments, questions, concerns were responded to in writing, okay? Whether they were satisfied or not, I can't speak to that. But it was a process where they had multiple opportunities to submit comments.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Any questions for this witness? Senator Bray.
Not a question, but I just wanted to thank you for your work with your neighbors. You know, we rely heavily in this state on engaged citizens helping us implement things. And so I appreciate both the agency and your local work to help move that forward for a really special and pristine region.
These are beautiful streams, and we hope you will all come and visit them sometime.
We have. They are beautiful.
Actually, Senator
Benning
beat me by about 2 seconds, so.
I'm just having a wicked deja vu moment. A few years ago when I was on your committee, Mark, were you testifying before Natural Resources? These very watersheds?
I don't think it was, no, not 12 years ago on these watersheds. I've been to that committee before on other things, but not on this particular topic.
It was all, I'm scratching my head. I know I've heard this subject before, and I swear it was when I was on your committee.
Yeah. And we did anti-degradation and.
Yeah.
So, Senator, I was only going to echo Senator Bray's comments and say thank you for the work. I actually was the attorney when Kidder Brook was classified as a Class A watershed. I think we were the second stream in the state back in front of old Water Resources Board, and I know the work that goes into it. So I appreciate the work, and it appears to me that you've met the standards and gotten the approval. And good work.
We hope so.
It's important.
Any other questions for Mr. Nelson, Chair of the Ripton Conservation Commission? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go anywhere, because when we're done.
Back here.
We've, yep. Sylvia Knight, Earth Community Advocate and Researcher from Burlington, who's on Zoom. Ms. Knight.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, Senator McDonald and members of the committee. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today about Vermont Water Quality Standards, File 22 P09. I may stick pretty close to my written text because it helps me. My name is Sylvia Knight. I live in Burlington with my husband. We are both members of a faith-oriented committee that considers water quality to be and protection of water quality to be a social justice issue. I have lived in the Lake.
We lost you. We lost you.
You just went mute.
Excuse me? I have not muted my.
I'm not.
Oh, it's not good.
So much for Burlington.
Maybe
good
maybe you should turning off the video part and only.
Sylvia, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Can you turn off your picture and just have your voice come through?
Turn off what?
Ah, there you're back.
You're back.
You're back.
For now.
We can hear you.
We need to move into closer.
No, you're okay. You're okay. We can hear you all of a sudden. Sylvia, you're all set. So keep going.
Okay, so I've lived in Lake Champlain watershed for over 40 years as an Earth Community Advocate and volunteer. I worked for over 25 years researching peer-reviewed literature on pesticides, endocrine disruption, and long-term dangers to Earth community, now also under threat from accelerating climate change. As a member of the Vermont Pfas Military Poisons Coalition, I'm learning about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or Pfas, how they are dangerous at extremely low concentrations and essentially never break down. I have shared scientific information with state agencies, legislators, and citizens seeking legislative reform. My profound concerns for life on Earth were not comforted when I read much of the proposed Water Quality Standards 2022. So I ask you to review the water quality standards through the lens of Earth community. That is an intimately interconnected community of life. Concepts of assimilative capacity, mixing zones, and waste management zones indicate that these rules expect waters to somehow absorb and carry away our toxic waste. Away where? where. This paradigm is dangerous and outdated, oblivious to our essential life connection with water and its universality, and oblivious to the kinds of toxins we are dealing with. This paradigm makes waters a commodity, disperse and dilute dangerous toxins for short-term corporate profit, contrary to ANR's responsibilities. By the way, you should know that waste management zones are unique to Vermont. They are not used anywhere else. When were they created? Are they approved by EPA? Now, please look at the filing for this document, for this docket 22P09. I refer you to page 4 and also have page 9 available. Page 4 asks, and in item 16, is the rule arbitrary? The language on page 9 of the filing in ANR's letter is added to address concerns about mixing zones, which a number of commentators wrote about. But this language is indeed arbitrary and a complete disconnect from reality. It cannot be allowed to stand. I will read it here. So in the letter, subchapter 1, sections 29A-102 definitions. Mixing zone means a length or area within waters required for the dispersion and dilution of waste discharges adequately treated to meet federal and state treatment requirements, and within which it is recognized that specific water use associated with the assigned classification for such waters may not be realized. And I want to underline the words adequately treated, because that, with the toxins we have now, they are not adequately treated. A mixing zone shall not extend more than 200 feet from the point of discharge. And we heard, was it Bethany or Hannah say that ANR's response to concerns expressed about mixing zones is this: a mixing zone shall not be used to meet water quality criteria for bioaccumulative toxins. This change is intended to clarify that the agency does not use mixing zones to meet water quality standards for bioaccumulative toxins. So I find this arbitrary and a disconnect from reality, from what ANR is actually doing now. ANR's response is neither a clarification, nor does it solve the problem. How do you keep a mixing zone to 200 feet? How do these standards address waste management zones of 1 to 5 miles of a stream? Mike, could you share the piece that I sent this morning? So let's look at some data on mixing zones and waste management zones. In a document, a data sheet from ANR, we see we've already heard that mixing zones don't exceed 200 feet, and we don't know how you control that. Waste management zones are measured in miles. miles of stream. So you can see these. There's a 2.6 miles of the Stevens Branch outside Berry City. Bennington, 3 miles of the Walloomsek River. Ludlow, there's 5.6 miles of the Black River. Montpelier, 4.5 miles of North Branch on the Winooski River. St. Johnsbury, 4.5 miles of the Passumpsic and Sleeper Rivers. So mixing zones have come under question in law journals and by EPA in 2015. I haven't shared that document with you, but I can. In relation to bioaccumulative toxins in the Great Lakes region. In a document of 2015 called Chapter 5, the Clean Water Act, they include a recommendation that management zones mixing zones be submitted to or subject to legislative action. So that's one of my recommendations. My recommendations to you are these. Well, I support the reclass of the 3 streams referred to by Mark Nelson. I ask you to decline to approve these standards, the whole standards as written. I recommend to the Vermont legislature that the use of mixing zones and waste management zones be subject to legislative action. And I urge ANR to begin robust stakeholder planning sessions for statewide waste management plan, including toxins. Thank you for considering these challenges to the water quality state standards. And if I can answer your questions, I will try, or I can get back to you with further information. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Next, any question? Forgive me. Jared Carpenter, Water Protection Advocate, Lake Champlain Committee.
Good morning, committee. Good to see you all. Had a good summer. So for the record, my name is Jared Carpenter. I'm with the Lake Champlain Committee, but I also testify today on behalf of a coalition who's been working on this issue. It consists of Connecticut River Conservancy, Conservation Law Foundation, and Vermont Natural Resources Council. With me today, if you haven't met him yet, is Mason Overstreet, who's a staff attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. Some folks may recognize him. He was with the Vermont Law School Environment Clinic beforehand, and he's worked on some of the surface water issues and similar issues before. You might be surprised that I am here largely in a support role today. Instead of usually when we come before Lcar, that is not necessarily the case. But in terms of pulling up my notes on the rule here, sort of had 3 points I wanted to make this afternoon, and I'll be brief considering the time, and I'm sure there's plenty of questions for everybody. One, our coalition of groups supports the final rule. We're part of an extensive stakeholder discussion with Pete, Bethany, and Hannah that went on for many months, many meetings, not just the advocate community, but the regulated community as well. It really was some great discussions. They took some of our suggestions, they rejected some of our suggestions, but we were always sort of discussing very fine points, sometimes all the way down to wordsmithing on specific issues. So it really was a good process as far as rulemaking goes, and appreciate their diligence on that. The second part is we support the reclassification of the Ripton waters. We think that this was also a very robust process, and to echo what Mark had said, that we think that this process needs to be discussed about how reclassification occurs. So it's still a process where affected parties, landowners and everyone gets to participate, but is not necessarily, needs to be, some of the criteria and things could be restructured. And this is something obviously that a committee of jurisdiction would get involved in, but we're very supportive. And thank the Ripon Conservation Commission for their hard work on this. Finally, one concern that we did have, and we have discussed this with DEC, with Pete, Bethany, and Hannah, is concerns. Oh, and I did send our comments around a few days ago. Hopefully the committee saw them. I noticed they haven't been posted. I will resend them, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that our comments on the proposed rule are posted. But you'll note that the first two sections of it are on monitoring for pesticides and Pfas. We think that this is for pesticides. EPA has set levels of what various criteria for all sorts of pages within the appendix of what are considered contaminated levels of various pesticides. Pfas, EPA is working on it, is our understanding. I think the goal is 2024. We wish that was a little sooner, but same thing. There is not monitoring for Pfas in our waters. So contamination levels are set, but we don't necessarily have the knowledge of, are the waters contaminated with certain levels of pesticides? Are the waters contaminated with certain levels of Pfas? There's a lot of different pesticides. There's a lot of different Pfas. I get is probably not possible to monitor for all of them. But we could monitor at least for some of the most, the ones that are used the most often, especially in terms of pesticides, your glyphosates, your neonics, things of that nature. This will probably involve money, as many things do. We don't want to put an extra burden on DEC if they are understaffed in many areas already. I don't know how many FTEs it would require. I don't know how much money, but this is of course something that could be discussed. So we would ask, obviously this is a policy issue. We've discussed it with DEC. We'd love to continue discussing what's feasible, what's not feasible, what's reasonable. But we would ask this committee to potentially send letters to the committees of jurisdiction to continue this discussion. And those are the 3 points I wanted to make this morning. I thank you very much for the time and can certainly question anything of that nature by all means.
We're now going to, I guess, ask questions to all of our witnesses tonight. Don't have to go anywhere.
Okay.
But what before we ask these rules, I understand, are separate and distinct from drinking water standards that are going to come up in rules in the future. Is that correct?
That's very much my understanding, but Hannah and Pete and Bethany can correct me otherwise. I'm not sure of a timeline on new drinking water standards or if those are underway.
Cool. Well, are there not separate standards for drinking water, which we anticipate are going to be coming down from the feds fairly soon? Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator McDonald. These are surface water rules that deal with quality and ambient surface waters. The drinking water rules are separate and distinct from that, and you're correct. EPA is continuing to work, and we anticipate by the end of the year that they'll have new standards, particularly for the PFASs for drinking water.
And the second one would be, is anyone representing or so far or has presented that these rules diminish the levels of water quality that are currently in rule?
No, these standards, we've increased the protection level across several of the so-called Appendix C criteria, the metals, and we have not backed off of the protection in any way.
Which doesn't say whether or not the current standard doesn't give it a grade, but it's represent that it hasn't diminished. And I guess the third one was, has it enhanced water quality standards to any substantial degree?
Yes, we feel like these are an improvement over our existing standards. As I mentioned, we've ratcheted up protection in several areas. For a lot of our standards, a lot of these standards are promulgated nationally by EPA, so-called 304A criteria. They're vetted, they're scientifically derived by EPA. They change over time. They ratchet downward over time. And when we do our triennial reviews, pick up those criteria and promulgate them in our standards, which we've done this time as well.
Oh, that's okay.
I would agree with that, Mr. Chairman. There's always the argument to be made of whether or not a state standard could be stricter than the federal standard, but that's much more of a case by case.
The two of our witnesses today have responded to those questions. The rest of the witnesses share that view, or do they dispute it? Mr. O'Grady, do you have an observation to those questions?
Well, to your original question about whether or not these rules are separate from a drinking water standard, they are, and you've already required ANR's drinking water rule to include standards for PFAS, which they have already incorporated for 5 PFAS substances. EPA is developing what they're calling the roadmap to provide additional requirements for drinking water. And from what I understand, ANR will comply with those when EPA finalizes them. And as to your question about whether or not this rule improves the protection of water quality, I think that's partly subjective, but it's also, this rule is responding largely to the legislative requirements to incorporate wetlands, to meet the requirements for issuing a Clean Water Act 401 certification. Much of what's in this rule, you actually required them to do, and the agency effectively closely followed your directive in amending the rule.
Mr. O'Grady, could you tell us your role here today and your role in state government?
I am the Deputy Chief Counsel for the Office of Legislative Counsel, and I staff the Natural Resources Committees and the Agriculture Committees for the legislature.
Just to say, he's our resident spokesperson for the legislature and has been for fortunate enough for over a decade, well over a decade. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Michael. My question is about when the EPA roadmap will be complete with regard to the PFAS chemicals. And I know that there's a lot going on, not just in our country, but globally on this. But do you have a sense of when that will be wrapped up? The EPA determination around PFAS chemicals overall, the roadmap.
So I believe the roadmap for water quality standards is 2024, but it's the federal government. They don't always meet their deadlines, and there's not a lot of accountability when they don't. So I really couldn't give you any certainty or surety about when. I will note that state statute, or actually it's a session law, but in 2019, the bill that came out of Senate Natural Resources requires ANR to propose water quality standards in rule by 2024. So regardless of what EPA does, there's already a mandate from the state for ANR to adopt water quality standards for PFAS by 2024.
Thank you.
Senator Bray.
Thanks, Mr. O'Grady. So because it didn't circulate, I only handed it off physically today. I wanted to let members of the committee know that on behalf of Senate Natural, I signed off on the rule. That said, we heard testimony from Ms. Knight and Mr. Ehlers and others expressing dismay around continued exposure to things like leachate, landfill leachate. And so I just wanted to verify with you that although I think probably everyone in this meeting has concerns about those exposures, that this rule isn't the tool in order to address those concerns. And that, so is that correct? And then I also wanted to ask a follow-on, which is, what would be the appropriate forum to address those concerns? Does that mean going back to committees of jurisdiction?
Well, the objections that I heard in the public input focus largely around the use of mixing zones for PFOA and PFAS substances. Even if you remove that authority from this rule, mixing zones would still be allowed under state statute. They would still be allowed under federal statute and federal rule. So if you want to somehow address mixing zones, you would have to really, in my opinion, address them statutorily. And then I would caution how you would address mixing zones, because there have been efforts in other jurisdictions to limit their application. And the department can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in the 8th Circuit. The EPA tried to limit the use of mixing zones for bacteria. And that would have cost something like $100 billion for municipal treatment works to comply with. So it was litigated, and the court said that EPA didn't follow proper rulemaking and potentially that the requirement was arbitrary. So you need to realize that, and again, the department can correct me if I'm wrong, mixing zones, waste management zones, they're used for bacteria, they're used for pathogens. I don't believe most wastewater treatment plants effectively treat all pathogens that are in effluent. I just don't know if that's the case in Vermont, nationally at best. So you need to have an area where those pathogens are diluted, bacteria is diluted, and a waste management zone is effectively an area to provide public notice of that. And remember, a NIPTES permit is a permit to discharge. It's not a permit to eliminate discharge, it's a permit to discharge. And in a waste management zone, you have to meet the water quality criteria for the pathogen. So I just wanted to raise some of those. If you want to address this, it needs to be done legislatively, in my opinion. And I think you need to be careful, because there's domino effect potentially from what you do in the regulation of mixing zones and waste management zones.
Thank you. I mean, I think my sense is that the fundamental challenge for any of these rules is we're dealing with problems after they're created, as opposed to proactively eliminating some of the sources of things that then become problematic to make rule. To address once they're introduced into the environment.
Prevention, primary.
Well, PFAS is in probably it's in everyone at this point. So we're all the sources. And so I don't know how you regulate us if we're the sources.
Representative Odie?
Thank you. You mentioned before letters to committees to continue to discuss some issues, and even though I was taking notes, I missed. Can you clarify exactly what you said? Exactly what issues you thought?
Yes, so for what I have mentioned, I know there's been a couple of other issues raised, was monitoring for pesticides and for PFAS levels in waters of the state, and whether or not that's just specific pesticides that are used more often than others, or if it is a pilot program, and then have, of course, a discussion with appropriations about costs, the agency to do that. We've sort of And there's going to be a jurisdictional issue with pesticides as well, because AFM has jurisdiction over these pesticides and the registration of pesticides, but ANR has jurisdiction over water quality. So you have a tension there of the AFM being, talking about the pesticides being used within the four corners of the farm, but once they run off the farm, they become, everybody's responsibility or everybody's concern. And then when they get into our waterways, what levels are there? And probably in different areas, there's going to be different levels of different pesticides. But if you know what you're dealing with in certain areas, then you can sort of tailor a response necessarily maybe to certain spots.
So that was one thing. Was there any other thing you mentioned?
What was the two was the monitoring of pesticides and of PFAS levels.
To monitor.
Improve the process, I thought you said.
Thank you, Senator. There's also the discussion of the reclassification of waters, where we are definitely supportive of the changes to Ripton, but there are a lot of other waters that are recommended for reclassification. They're posted in the tactical basin plans, with the processes getting them from recommendation through reclassification to the point where they have those higher standards and have that higher level of protection. Thank you, Senator.
And okay, so you think it should be easier to do?
Well, I think it's worthy of discussion about how that process works. Whether or not easier is probably not the right word, but maybe less burdensome, less cumbersome, I don't know. I'm not gonna.
When I said easy, I thought that's the wrong word. Okay.
Nothing's easy.
I'm not a fan of using the word.
Nothing's cumbersome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we're running out of time. I would like to ask somebody from the agency in particular, hang on just a second. Sorry about that. It's funny, but just the other day I talked to an individual who works for an environmental group that delineates wetlands. This rule hasn't even gone into effect yet, and he was telling me that two properties that they've gone out on for the Agency of Natural Resources did not meet qualifications for any form of building at all, and they also were in the process of working with a particular project where somebody had encroached on wetlands and are working to remedy that situation. I guess my question is, I've always been concerned with property rights, and I'm just wondering what ANR's response is or ability to work with property owners who, through no fault of their own, purchase a piece of property where, when going through this process, find out that what is the agency's mission or responsibility to work with property owners to see if there really can be an area on that property that could be built on. And again, if not, that opens up a huge question for me as a lister or whether overall in the state of Vermont, we seem to, anyway, it's a discussion and concern for me, whether it's tying up land through conservation and I guess I'll just stop there.
I can certainly speak to that. The water quality standards that are in front of you as a rule today don't deal specifically with wetlands. What we've done with wetlands in the standards is to provide the linkage to our state wetland rule, a separate and different rule that follows state statute as to protection of significant wetlands here in Vermont. I agree that it's a poorly understood resource. And we are also, the agency is undergoing a multi-year process currently to update and improve our statewide wetland mapping to be able to provide the resources for landowners, for prospective buyers, for prospective projects to better be able to identify areas on the ground that are wetlands. That said, there's nothing like having a trained wetland scientist out on the field to walk your property with you, to identify areas that may be upland, areas that may be wetland, the extent of the buffer for those wetlands. again, all of that, all of those protections follow from state statute and our wetland rules. But regardless, the wetland program, our state wetland program, is very responsive. They spend most of their summer in the field conducting site visits with landowners, advising them as to where the wetland resource is, where areas that can be developed. And even if there is a wetland, there is a permitting process by which incursions into buffers and wetlands can occur, if there is a lack of alternatives on the site. So our wetland permitting process is really 3-layered, where we look for, first, are there alternatives? Can you build it somewhere else on your property that's not a wetland? If you can't, how can you best minimize the impact to the wetland? And thirdly, if you do actually need to affect the wetland, then the mitigation process for compensating for that loss of wetland. Again, these are for state protected wetlands. The Army Corps of Engineers in the state also separately and differently regulates wetlands under federal law. So sometimes there is concurrent jurisdiction, sometimes there are different jurisdictions, but our wetland program spends a lot of time working with landowners, and they're always available. We have regionalized staff that are available to go out with property owners and help advise them as to the extent of wetlands and the process for acquiring permits if necessary.
Thank you for that.
Senator Bray.
Senator Lyons has her hand up as well. I was going to say, if there's no further discussion, I'll go ahead and make the motion anyway, that we approve rule, subject to what we're going to learn in a moment, but 22P09, and then when we get to that point in our meeting today, to also recommend a letter to committees of jurisdiction. Because it's clear that we're looking at a piece of a puzzle, and we know there are other problems in the overall puzzle, and we'd like to make sure committees of jurisdiction are aware of that sort of comprehensive.
Senator Bray has made a motion to approve the rule, and we'll continue our discussion, and witnesses feel free to ask questions of witnesses. Senator Lyons.
I don't have a question. I want to just comment. I know that Michael O'Grady indicated we can't regulate people, but we can regulate the amount of PFAS that we're putting out into our products and in our environment. And I think about it as the mixing zone, so that the next generation is a broader mixing zone where we have less PFAS going out into this group of people, so that in the future we reduce the exposure and the amount that we carry around with us. So I want to just really emphasize the need for prevention going forward and limiting the amount of this stuff that actually gets out into people and into the environment. That's all. And my mixing zone analogy.
Okay.
Any other questions for our witnesses? So let's, discussion now is, Senator Bray's made a motion. What's the committee's pleasure? Any discussion? Well, I would like to summarize what I think I've heard, that there's many differences of opinions if we were going to change our water quality standards, whether to make them more stringent or less stringent. But these rules don't affect that. That these rules, generally speaking, are continue what we have. Water quality rules will be coming up next. And certainly, Representative Higley, property rights and whatever, I'm in a strange position of having lived in Fort Myers Beach, Florida, and run a shrimp boat down there for a couple of years. And as the business would have it, I probably would have been fishing off the Texas coast last week when those people who exercised their property rights find that they no longer own any property. And they're going to be dealing with very difficult problems in their environment. And I imagine Vermont will have a robust debate on how we become more stringent or more relaxed in our water water quality standards in future legislation and perhaps future rules. I'm of the opinion that this doesn't make any changes, but it's certainly highlighted what will be before us. So, any further discussion on the rules before us?
Just real quickly to comment on what you have just said, I can understand that, but again, I think it's important for Vermont when we are discussing this through committees of jurisdiction, that this property rights provision is considered and somehow addressed. And I don't know, it's a tough one when it comes to an individual who unknowingly, what is it going to be? A requirement that every piece of property before it's sold goes through a wetlands delineation study? Granted, Mr. Laflamme said that we're trying to expand the wetland maps, but I know I've seen those as well. And these folks that come in to delineate, they could be way off the map and still have it. So again, it is a concern for me that, on one hand, you have to weigh water quality issues and the whole downstream event and all that. But again, there is a human investment, personal property rights issue here. So I hope that that's addressed as well.
Representative Higley and I say, stay tuned because this will be a mini series in the years to come. And
can't wait to tune in.
Thank you.
For
Thank you.
acting on the three wetlands coming up.
Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor of motion by Senator Bray, say aye. All opposed, say nay. And the rule has passed, and we've set the stage for a possible mini-series that everybody will anticipate.
And we have letters. We're sending all those.
Thank you. The final item on the agenda, Anthea, were you going to speak to that?
Yeah, I can do it. So I'm going to talk about this chart, which will be the last thing in your stack of paperwork. So you may remember from over the summer, you got an email from Deputy State Auditor Ash making some recommendations. And one of those recommendations was to start tracking rulemaking authority. And in that recommendation, he had talked about different sort of agencies that could be told to do the tracking through law, or whether or not it's something that Ledge Council could do. If Ledge Council does it, you just have to ask us to do it. So I worked with Representative Squirrel and my colleagues, in particular, Mike O'Grady and Jen Carby. And one of the things that happens at the end of every legislative session, and you can see the final versions of these on the top banner for every act, is there's an act summary, and those are prepared by Ledge Council attorneys. And it's just to give you like a short version of what happened in a potentially long act. Part of what we do when we prepare those act summaries is we track some information that we maintain internally. And what we are suggesting Ledge Council could do to create a database going forward, starting with the 2023 legislative session, is that top chart that you see that says tracking chart for each act, that would get filled out by Ledge Council attorneys, and we would maintain that information internally. And then we would generate the second chart. And to be clear, this is just an excerpt, a sampling, a portion of the 2020 acts and resolves that either created or amended rulemaking authority. And this would be a database that would exist. Lcar could use it, the chairs of the standing committees could use it, Charlene and I could use it, members of Ledge Council could use it, and it would provide a snapshot of the ways that law have changed the enabling authority that agencies within the executive branch have to adopt rules. It would be, and this is why there's the little disclaimer at the end, it would be a tool. It wouldn't necessarily, just because there's a lot that is in every act, it might not capture everything that added or amended rulemaking authority, but the hope is that if it's done right at the end of session when all the acts are fresh in the attorney's minds, that will capture the vast majority of the additions and changes to the universe that the executive branch can be adopting rules or changing rules under. So happy to answer questions, but that's what we're suggesting as a way to address that recommendation. And we would start next session. And these, I think, these 5 are just a smidge of the ways that you, the General Assembly, changed rulemaking authority last session.
I think it's a great idea. It's a start, and I think it's terrific.
And then one of the things that I mentioned, either just to Representative Squirrel or maybe in my email, is that this is what we came up with for starting next year. If you, a year from now, are looking at the database and you say, wow, it would be really useful if we knew X about a particular row in the chart, then we could start tracking that going forward.
Questions for Anthea?
Okay.
Could you, next meeting, just remind us of this committee's authority in demanding or that rules be promulgated that have gone
Undone.
have yet to take place when the legislature voted, and the public's ability to petition this committee to make such demands of the administration when it appears to the petitioners that rules that have been called for in statute have not manifested themselves, have been ignored. That I don't think this committee has called for rules to be written on a topic in over a decade. Senator Bray.
I don't know if we're still on this topic. I'm just thinking of 2 housekeeping items. As we approved rules today, Senator Lyons on Rule 22E14 suggested a letter. And as we just worked on 2209, the water quality standards, we're suggesting a letter. So I don't know if we want to go over that while we're here and ask our council to draft something for our next meeting.
Anthea, you are aware of the committees that being referred to, and will you present to us a letters for our consideration at the next meeting?
Yeah, so we can do that. I just want to make sure that I have the general gist. So I'm thinking that on 22P05, which was the cable television rule, that you want a letter sent to the committees of jurisdiction, which would be Senate Finance and House Energy and Technology, on the unintended consequences of the regulation of cable on the expansion of broadband.
Yeah, so the copper versus.
Or at least the issues,
fiber,
potential issues and unintended consequences. Yeah.
Potential issues and unintended.
Yeah.
And then on 22P09, I took notes on what Jared Carpenter had suggested, which was a letter asking the committees of jurisdiction to look into the issue of monitoring for 1, pesticides, and 2, Pfas in waters of the state. And then the third issue would be for the committees of jurisdiction to look at improving the process for reclassifying waters going forward, and not making it easier, but maybe making it more streamlined or less cumbersome, or whatever the committees of jurisdiction end up looking into there. Is there anything else that you wanted in that one?
Any objections? Yeah, we'll look forward to your presentation at our next meeting. Senator Bray.
I think it might be worth adding a third thing on the last one, and that is just a consideration of preventative measures, as Senator Lyons was pointing out, and that the committee, that because health and welfare sort of works with things inside buildings, and once they get out of the building, we're working on our committee, that both committees receive that letter.
Okay, so then it would be.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, so I'm glad you did that.
Senate Natural, House Natural, Senate Health and Welfare, and then is it House Human Services?
Thank you.
We spread a wide net today.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if it is appropriate time for a motion to adjourn, I would move that we adjourn.
Representative Benning channeling Representative Myers. Continue the tradition.
Senator Benning.
Senator Benning. Senator Benning is moving to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Say nay, and we are adjourned.
Next meeting.
Thank you, committee.